Well, we are in our final week of our series, Unfriended. And over this series, we've been talking about how social media and the devices that we often access social media on have had this incredible effect on us individually and on us as a society. And in week one, what we saw was that there's a direct connection between the quality of your relationships and how you see yourself. That the people who you have relationships have an effect on how we perceive ourselves to be. And in the second week, what we said was that because these devices and social media have become such a distraction, that it doesn't take long for that distraction to turn into destruction. In other words, if we're not paying attention, if we're not careful, we can be so distracted from what's going on in life around us by the thing that's in our hands that it can actually become destructive to us. And in the third week, we asked ourselves this question: how can I use social media to love God and to love others? And then finally, last week, Jeffrey was here, and he reminded us that we have a choice to make, and God shows His reckless love for us. And so that we should also show that same kind of reckless love for other people. So as we wrap it up today, I want to kind of take us back to when, if you are on social media, if you remember the first time that you signed up for social media, the very first time. Maybe it wasn't that exciting. Maybe it was kind of intimidating. I remember the first social media that I ever signed up for was MySpace. And I didn't want to do it. I felt like I was already too old for it, but everybody said, oh, you should get on, and so I went on there. And I made the mistake of posting, because you have to put a picture on there, right? And I put a picture of myself that was 10 years old. Not because I was trying to fool anybody, it was the only picture that I had. And so I threw it up there, and the first thing that happened was someone said, hey, why do you have a picture on there from high school? And it wasn't from high school, it was after high school, but it was really kind of embarrassing. And so I decided since then I am not going to put any pictures up that make me look younger than I really am, which no one's going to know how young that actually is. But if you are on Facebook, do you remember when you first signed up for Facebook? You had to put your email in, and then it said give you a password, and your password was password, because that's what we did. And then it would ask you a bunch of questions like what school did you go to, what college did you go to, where do you work right now? And then when you clicked next, this screen popped up with a whole bunch of pictures of different people, right? People that you have in common with because you answered those questions and they found people that you had something in common with. And then Facebook would ask you, hey, do you know this person? Do you know that person? And you would look at him, oh, that's my friend from high school. Oh, that's the guy that lived next to us when I was growing up. Hey, that's my cousin from Florida. So you started sending out requests to all these people. And then, like many people, maybe some of you, I didn't, but maybe some of you, you get on Facebook and you start logging on there, and the next thing you do is you start stalking your exes. Catching up is what you call it. You don't really call it stalking. I'm just catching up on them, see how they're doing, right? See if they have a better life than you do. And you kind of look at them and see if they're fat, bald, and miserable. You kind of gloat a little bit. And you remember the first time that you got poked on Facebook? That's a Facebook thing. It's not, anyway. You got poked on Facebook until you saw it was your fat, bald, and miserable ex-boyfriend from high school wanting to catch up with you. And then Facebook was weird. I totally forgot about this, but I remember that when I first got on, the only thing that I saw from Facebook was invitations to play Farmville. And first one came, and you were like, oh, that's funny. And then by the 78th time that you got an invitation to Farmville, you were trying to figure out how you can just stop getting the invitations. And then one day, you log on, and you notice that your 64 friends was down to 63. And so you started scouring through your friends list to see who the traitor was that abandoned you, that unfriended you. Because secretly on the inside, when stuff like that happens, we naturally wonder, what did I do? What did I do to make them unfriend me? See, there are two things about friends. First of all, friends are awesome. It's true. Whether it's online or in real life, having lots of friends, having lots of people that know us is an awesome thing because we need people to hang out with. We need people to confide in. We need people to laugh with, to do stuff with. Friends are awesome, but friends will eventually let you down because friends are people, and sometimes people suck at life. And the people that you thought you could rely on, you suddenly learn aren't that reliable. And those lessons can be painful. The writer of the book Proverbs writes it like this. He says, depending on an unreliable person in a crisis is like trying to chew with a loose tooth or walk with a crippled foot. Now, those are very vivid images of what it's like when you trust someone and then you find out later that that person isn't trustworthy. And you didn't intentionally rely on somebody who wasn't reliable, and you thought you could rely on them, and when they didn't come through and when they let you down, you weren't just surprised, you were hurt. There's a king named David who lived in the time of ancient Israel, and this is how he described feeling like that, hurt by his friends. Listen to what he writes. He says, "It is not an enemy who taunts me. I could bear that. It's not my foes who so arrogantly insult me. I could have hidden from them. Instead, it is you, my equal, my companion, and close friend. What good fellowship we once enjoyed as we walked together to the house of the Lord." Now, Bible scholars will tell you that they're not sure who he's talking about. They're not sure if he's talking about Saul or his son Absalom, but whoever it wasn't just an acquaintance. It wasn't somebody that he just happened to know. It was one of his closest friends. And he doesn't see the betrayal coming. And that's why he's so shocked. He's saying, man, listen, if it were an enemy, I would expect it, okay. I'd be ready for it. But you were my friend. Now, have you ever felt that way? Have you ever felt like someone that you trusted betrayed you? So how do you get past that? How do you get past the hurt, the betrayal? How do you move on when the other person doesn't seem like they want to move on? How do you reconcile when the other person isn't interested in reconciliation? Now listen, if you're asking these questions, then I have some good news for you. You aren't alone. Many of us have experienced that, and Scripture has a lot to say with that, especially because Jesus had times where he had to deal with the people who were most committed to him, the people who knew him the best, being the first ones to bail when it mattered most. So today, as we wrap up our series, what I want to do is take a look at what Jesus had to say about what we should do when someone close to us betrays us or lets us down. So we're going to be looking at this account, and at this point in the story, Jesus had already been dead. He had already been crucified, he'd been buried, and then he'd been risen from the dead. And after he rose from the dead for about 40 days, he went around the countryside. He was meeting with people, encouraging them, reminding them what they were really there for. And earlier, before that, he had told his disciples that after he died, he would rise again. He told them that this is what would happen. And then he told them that he would wait for them in a city called Galilee, and they should go and meet him there after he dies. And that's where we learn the very first lesson about what to do with the hurt, what to do when we are hurt by people. And the first lesson is this, is we have to remember that people mean well, but no one does the right thing all the time. People mean well, but no one does the right thing all the time. So here we see that disciples, they do go to Galilee. They listen to what Jesus said. They went to Galilee. And this is what it says. This is the account that was written. It says, later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. Several of the disciples were there: Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. So Jesus had 12 followers, and those 12 followers, they thought that they would have Jesus, they would be able to be with Jesus for more than the 3 years that they were. And this was not a group of people who were already friends. I mean, this was a pretty rough group. There were sailors, there were fishermen, there were a politician and a corrupt tax collector. They didn't start out as best friends. They were just kind of put together. But they did believe that Jesus was the one that they had been waiting for, the one that had been prophesied, the one that they were told was going to restore God's rule and be the leader of God's kingdom on earth. So when Jesus was arrested and he was crucified and buried, this was a complete shocker to them. They couldn't understand what happened. This was supposed to be the guy that was going to turn everything around for them and their people, and instead he ends up being dead. And if that wasn't shocking enough, what happens next blows them away, because 3 days later, Jesus is alive. And he's walking around and he's given people instructions on what they're supposed to do next. Now, this must have been strange enough that the guy that you were with, you thought he was going to be the one, and he ends up dead, and now you're thinking, okay, everything's over. And then a few days later, people are telling you that they see him, he's walking around. So it's already strange, but it's probably especially strange for Peter, who was the leader of the disciples. Now, Peter was always the extrovert of the group. He was always saying the wrong thing. He was always apologizing. Peter was one of those ready, fire, aim kind of a guys all the time. But Peter was the guy who said to Jesus, Jesus, I love you more than any of these other guys, and I'm even willing to die for you if I have to. And because Peter was the leader, when everyone heard him say that, they all said the same thing. Peter was the guy that when Jesus was arrested, he takes out his sword and he cuts off that guy's ear. And Jesus is like, Peter! And he goes and picks up the guy's ear and puts it back and makes it heal again. That's Peter. Peter was the guy, though, that went to Jesus' trial, heard his death sentence, and then when a middle school girl went up to him and asked him if he knew Jesus, Peter was the first person to deny Jesus. Peter was that guy. So for Peter, this whole go to Galilee and wait thing was really awkward, because first Jesus is dead and now he's not. And now he has to face Jesus, who told Peter that he was going to deny him. And Peter said, no, Lord, there's no way I'm going to deny you. And Peter does it anyway. And now he has to actually see Jesus. And he's not looking forward to that awkward conversation. So there they are. They're in Galilee. And they're waiting. And they're waiting. And they're waiting. And I can imagine that Peter was probably waiting there and just stressing out about the whole thing. But there they were, just waiting. And it all becomes too much. Peter's got so much of this bottled up inside him that he says, I can't take it anymore, and he decides to give up. He's had enough, and he wants to go back to the life that he had before he even met Jesus. So the account of this event goes on. It says, Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. We'll come too, they all said. So they went out in the boat, but caught nothing all night. See, Peter was the leader. So when he said, hey, I'm going back to do it, I'm out of here, I'm going to go back to doing what I was doing before, everyone else followed. Now, when Peter was talking to Jesus and he was saying all those things, did he mean well? Absolutely. I'm sure that in every commitment that he made to Jesus, he really meant it. And could he be counted on to do all of the things that he said? Well, if you read through, he probably was okay about half the time. So now before we see how this awkwardness between Peter and Jesus is finally resolved, I want you to think about something. Especially as we think about the people in our lives that let us down. The people in your life that you love, they really do mean well. When they make you that promise, when they make that commitment, when they tell you they're going to be there, they mean well. But they might let you down. You might not always be able to count on them. You might discover that they're really unreliable, but in their heart, they mean well. So when you're dealing with the hurt of losing a friendship or the pain of a betrayal, I want to encourage you to start there. To start with the fact that they mean well. And here's something else we can do, and this is the second thing. If they're not willing to meet you halfway, then meet them where they are. Now, usually when we think of compromise, what we think of is there's a guy over here, there's a person over here, and there's a person over here, and they're on opposite ends, and then they just slowly walk towards each other until we meet in the middle, right? That's what we think of when we think of compromise. And that sounds fair, and sometimes it actually happens like that. But if you look back on your relationships, especially on the ones where it broke somewhere but it got restored, most of the time what happens is not that you walk back together and meet in the middle. Most of the time, what happens is that one person goes all the way to where the other person is. That the reconciliation only happens because one person decided that they weren't willing to just go halfway. They wanted to go however far it took to bring the relationship back. Peter denied Jesus, and that is a huge thing, especially back in that time. He denied not even knowing who he was. And sure, he felt bad, but like a lot of us, he let his pride and his ego get in the way. And all he had to do, all he had to say to himself was, I'm going to wait here in Galilee, and when Jesus comes, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to apologize. I'll just say sorry. But like many of us, because of our pride and our ego, instead of confronting the person and apologizing, we don't. And like Peter, he just decided, I'm going to wash my hands of this and I'm going to walk away. I'm going to leave and go back to doing what I was doing before I ever met this Jesus guy. And so Peter went back to being a fisherman. And what does Jesus do? He knows Peter's gone fishing. So he goes to the beach where he knows Peter will be docking his boat after fishing. And Peter, as it said before, Peter and the guys are out all night, they're fishing all night, and they don't catch a thing, and they're finally heading back to shore. Now, this is what happens when they're heading back to shore. It says, at dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, fellas. I just can't imagine Jesus saying fellas. Fellas, have you caught any fish? I mean, he's screaming this out. Fellas, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. Then he said, throw out your net on the right-hand side of the boat and you'll get some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, it's the Lord. When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, jumped into the water, and headed to shore. The others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to the shore, for they were only about 100 yards from shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire, and some bread. Now, I want to show you something really, really cool about what's happening in that whole part of the story. And I can't go into the whole thing right now, so just remember Luke 5, write it down, put it in your notes somewhere. When you watch this again, you'll see it, Luke 5, go back and read it, because we can't do that whole story right now. But this particular part of the story is interesting to me, because this chapter of the story in Luke 5, we find Jesus preaching on the exact same beach, that exact same beach where he met Peter and the disciples after they went fishing. Jesus was on that beach and he was preaching to a huge crowd. And the crowd got so big that it started to come up onto the beach where he was. And so what he did was he jumped up onto one of the boats and he told this guy, who turns out to be a guy named Peter, he says, push me out into the water so that I can talk to the people. It was easier for him to be out on the water. So Jesus is out on the water, and he's still talking to the people. And then after that sermon, after he was done preaching, Jesus tells Peter to push farther out from the water so he could catch some fish. And you know what Peter does? Well, Peter tells him what they had been doing. He says, here's the funny part. We've been out all night and we haven't caught anything. Does this sound familiar? But because you say so, this is what Peter says, because you say so, I will. So he goes out, just like Jesus says, and he catches so much fish that his nets start to tear. And that's when he realizes that this Jesus who is in front of him is not just an ordinary man. And that's when Jesus tells Peter to come and follow me, and I will make you a fisher of men. So now it's 3 years later, and they're on the exact same beach. And Peter and the guys are heading back to shore, and they all see Jesus on the shore, and they don't recognize him because he's like this big, right? So they don't know that that's Jesus. And then Jesus yells out, "Did you catch anything, fellas?" And they said, "No." And Jesus says, "Throw your nets on the other side of the boat." Now, don't you wonder what they must have been thinking? They've been out all night. They've been throwing the net out and dragging it back in all night long, and they have caught nothing. They're tired. They're hungry. No one has a Snickers bar. I mean, it's just tired. And they're rowing back in after fishing all night, catching not a single thing. And here's this guy standing on the shore, way too happy for this early in the morning. And he tells them, "Hey, throw it on the other side of the net." And it's like, seriously? Don't you think that we've tried that already? Man, I wish I would have thought of that. But you know what they do? They do it anyway. And it must have felt like deja vu for them, because they threw the net in, and Scripture tells us that when they pulled the nets back up, they had caught 153 large fish. Because that's how God is. When He provides big. And so Peter is there, and something clicks. Something starts to make sense. He's like, "Hold on, wait a second. I remember this beach. I remember this boat. I remember what happened 3 years ago." And in typical Peter fashion, he jumps out of the boat and he starts swimming to the shore. And when the rest of the guys finally get all of the fish onto the boat and head back into shore and get on the beach, they see that Jesus had already cooked breakfast for them. I mean, it's not Spam, eggs, and rice. But I would imagine fresh fish and bread early in the morning on the beach would taste pretty good. And despite the tension between Peter's denials of Jesus and the fact that Peter, who meant well, couldn't even wait for Jesus where he told him to wait, Jesus goes to where Peter was. And rather than wait for Peter to move halfway, Jesus went all the way to where Peter was. Now, I'm not saying that that's right, and I'm not saying that that's fair. But when someone hurts you or betrays you, if there is ever going to be a reconciliation, you can't just sit back and wait for the other person to finally get it and come to you. You can't just sit back and say to yourself, "Well, one day they will regret it." Demanding that they meet you halfway and refusing to go any farther isn't going to work. If you want to really restore the relationship, if you want to reconcile that relationship, you have to make the decision. You have to choose to meet them where they are. And then when you do that, you're going to have to do this. This is the third thing. You have to be honest about your hurt and be willing to accept the level of friendship they're able to offer. So when you finally get in front of them, it isn't the time to pretend that nothing happened. You don't just say, "No, it was no problem, it wasn't a big deal," because it was. You have to be honest about what they did and how it affected your relationship. But if we go back to our story, right, and this next part is going to sound a little weird, so just hang with me for a minute and it'll start to make sense. But when we get back to the story, this is what happens. It says, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied, "you know I love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said, "you know I love you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. A third time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." Now, I want you to think about this. Breakfast is done, right? All the cups and the plates are burning in the fire. Jesus, Peter, and the disciples are sitting around because it's still early in the morning. They're sitting around the fire. And when Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" See, that's when I see it, that's what I see. I see Jesus saying, "Do you love me more than these?" But for 2,000 years, theologians have been trying to figure out what Jesus meant when he said these. Was he talking about the fish? Like, do you love me more than these 153 fish? Well, 151 fish because they ate 2 for breakfast. Do you love me more than these fish? Do you love me more than these boats? But I just see Jesus sitting there and saying, "Do you love me more than these guys? Do you love me more than these dudes who are here with us? Do you love me more than these?" Because remember, Peter was the one who blurted out, "Jesus, I love you the most, more than these guys do. In fact, I'm so committed to you, I would die for you." So when Peter is sitting around the fire and Jesus asks Peter, "Do you love me more than these?" I don't think it's that hard to figure out what he's talking about. But here's where it gets a bit complicated. Because the scriptures weren't written in English, they were written in Greek. And some words don't translate straight across from English to Greek. We use the word love in many ways. Like I would say, "I love my son." I would also say, "I love pizza." I would also say, "I love the Niners." Same word, very different applications. But in the Greek, there are 4 different words for love. And in this passage that we just read, 2 of them are used. Now, the 2 that they use is, the first one is the Greek word agape, which is the unconditional, no matter what kind of love. And then there is phileo love, which is more like the "I love you like a friend" kind of a love. So let's read this again with that slight difference where I'm going to highlight the difference in the words. Listen, remember, agape is the unconditional, no matter what kind of love. Phileo is the more, "I just love you like a friend" kind of a love. This is how it would read if we translated that a little bit better. After breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you agape love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," Peter replied. "You know I phileo love you." "Then feed my lambs," Jesus told him. Jesus repeated the question, "Simon, son of John, do you agape love me?" "Yes, Lord," Peter said. "You know I phileo love you. Then take care of my sheep." Jesus said a third time, he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you agape love me?" Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I phileo love you." Jesus said, "Then feed my sheep." See, Peter was very specific here. He was trying to say, "Listen, Lord, I love you like a friend, but I can't say that it's unconditional love anymore. I can't say that I love you unconditionally because the last time that I said that, I screwed it all up. So I refuse to go there. So every time you insist that it's agape love, I'm telling you what I can give you is phileo love." And what does Jesus do with the answer that Peter gives him? He accepts what Peter is able to give him. He takes what Peter can give. Earlier, Jesus told Peter that he would one day be the leader of the first church. And leading a church is much like being a shepherd, which makes lots of sense because in the first century, they were living in an agricultural community, and so they kind of all understood what shepherd meant. So when Peter said, "Yes, I phileo love you, Jesus," Jesus was reinstating in Peter his call and his purpose. In other words, Jesus was giving back to Peter that thing that Peter walked away from. Peter didn't lose his calling when he denied Jesus. Peter lost his calling when he walked away from Jesus. And from that first moment in the boat 3 years before, Jesus already knew all of the ways that Peter would fail. Jesus knew that Peter would be making all of these commitments to him and not living up to them. Jesus knew that he would fail. And Jesus still thought it was a good idea for Peter to be the leader of the church. And then Jesus does what you and I should always do. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but it's something that we should always do. Love always assumes the best about the other person and is gracious when the other person isn't at their best. I want to say that one more time. Love always assumes the best about the other person, and love is gracious when the other person isn't at their best. See, up until now, Jesus has been very gracious with Peter. Despite his betrayal, despite his letting him down, despite his not waiting for him, Jesus has been gracious. But more than that, Jesus continues to see the best in Peter, even when Peter can't see the best in himself. And even when Peter wasn't willing to say that he could give his unconditional love to Jesus, Jesus knew that one day he would. Look what Jesus tells Peter in verse 18. He says, I tell you the truth. And this is Jesus talking to Peter. He says, I tell you the truth. When you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. See, Jesus is saying to him, listen, you may not think that you love me unconditionally now, but Peter, I know you better than you know you. A long time ago, you told me that you loved me more than anything and more than anyone, and that you would even die for me. And Peter, listen, I'm telling you right here, right now, you were right. And history tells us that what Jesus told Peter is exactly what happened. Because many years later, Peter was crucified. And he died as a martyr for Jesus. He died because he decided to follow Jesus. Only, as legend puts it, that Peter asked the ones that were executing him, he told them that he wasn't worthy to be crucified like Jesus, and he asked to be crucified upside down. See, Jesus' love for Peter assumed the best about Peter, saw the best in Peter, even when Peter wasn't at his best. And that's what you and I have to do too. If we want to get past the hurt from the loss of a friend, if we want to get past the hurt of betrayal, we have to remember that we have to look at the best in other people and be gracious when they are not at their best. Love always assumes the best about the other person. And when all of the signs point to the fact that you can't assume the best about the person, that you shouldn't assume the best about the person, that this person is going to let you down again, when everything tells you that that is what's going to happen, you still have to choose to be gracious with them. So what do we have to do if we're going to get past the hurt? We have to understand that people mean well, but they're going to let us down. We have to choose to meet them where they are if they're not willing to meet us halfway. We have to be honest about our hurt and be willing to accept the level of friendship that they can offer. And we have to assume the best in them and then be gracious when they're not at their best. See, Jesus and Peter's story ended really well. They reconciled. But listen, not all of Jesus' relationships had that same happy ending. And neither are ours. We're not going to get reconciliation and resolution from all of our relationships. Sometimes, no matter what you do, the other person just isn't going to get it and isn't going to want to get it. They won't allow themselves to be reconciled with you. They won't allow you to come after them. And so the question is, when you get there, what do you do then? So 2 things before we go. 2 things real quick. First, Paul would write this in Romans. He said, if it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. So if you have someone in your life and you've tried to reconcile and it just isn't happening, then make sure you've done everything that you can do. And if there's conflict that needs to be resolved and you can't resolve it together, at least resolve it on your end. Even if the other person won't resolve theirs, resolve it on your end. And if you don't know how to do that, then just listen to Jeff's message from last week, because he really goes deep into that. See, God doesn't hold you responsible for the things you can't do, but He does hold us responsible for the things that we can do. So we can't force the other person to reconcile with us, but we can make sure that we do everything that we can do and that we need to do to make that relationship right. And then second, when you're hurt and when the other person won't reconcile with you, then what you have to do is you have to lean into God. Take the hurt, take the frustration, take the anger, and lean into Him. Remember how we started out today in Psalm 55, and we heard what David had said, because David had been blindsided by someone that he was really close to, that he put his trust in, that he really confided in? This is how he ends that psalm in verse 22. Listen to what he says. After talking about all of the hurt that he has experienced, he says this: "Give your burdens to the Lord, and He will take care of you. He will not permit the godly to slip and fall." So when you can't get there, when there's no way to get there, go to God. Give your burdens to Him and let Him take care of you. Because when you do that, when God has you in His grip, He won't let you go. Because He knows what it's like to be betrayed. He knows what it's like to have someone who's very, very close to Him turn their backs on Him. So when you tell Him how you feel, He'll know exactly how you feel. And that's what He wants you to do. Bring it to Him.